Welcome to Unpicking Dissonance, a podcast brought to you by the Leeds UK music collective known as Fold. My name's Seth Moshowitz, I'm the founder of Fold, and I'm the host of this podcast. Thanks to everyone who listened to the very first episode. Your support means a lot to us. Since this is the first proper episode where we really start getting into things, I'd originally intended it to be a conversation with a guest, but I realized that I should probably delve a bit more into what will be the framework of that conversation, as it requires a certain amount of defining parameters and explaining where I'm coming from with some of the terminology, especially as the first question involves describing what your core story is. Given that stories form the sort of cognitive framework of our reality, can you summarize the story that forms your core identity? I'm not sure that everybody can immediately do that. I know I've asked a couple of people and some were like, oh yeah, boom, boom, boom. Others are like, well, you know what, I haven't really thought about that. And in particular, most people probably don't stop to think about the difference between stories and narratives. Obviously, people who teach language and who have a really solid grasp of linguistics will be able to rattle that off pretty quickly. But does the average person have a clear idea in their head about what those definitions are? I'm not so sure. So this and many other things I will be discussing in this episode, and I will be sharing with you my own core story as a starting point. So the best way that I can do that, I'm not very good at improvising on this scale, so I'm going to actually read to you from a series of articles that formed a zine that we released with our 2024 project, We Do Not Forget. And if you want, you can read these articles in full on both our Substack and our website. I'll put links in the show notes. So I'm not going to read absolutely the whole thing, but the first article in this series was called Why Shit's So Crazy, which is a quote from the great Reggie Watts. Was the name of an album / improv show that he released in 2010. The name is self-explanatory, right? But it asks an important question. So here we go. And I apologize to anyone listening who's read all of these articles already, if you're one of the very few people who has done so, but just consider it like a little audiobook version. The songs on We Do Not Forget embody a process of coming to terms with a particularly turbulent and challenging time in both the wider world and in our own lives as individuals. To recap the former, we had the pandemic from early 2020 until 2022, roughly, the war in Ukraine from February 2022, the genocide in Gaza from October 2023, and the looming specter of climate change all throughout, not to mention the many other humanitarian crises in Somalia, Afghanistan, Democratic Republic of Congo, Yemen, Syria, South Sudan, and elsewhere. Apart from the emotional turmoil and the toll on mental health for those of us outside of these wars, let alone inside of them, a combination of the pandemic aftermath, Ukraine war, and climate change in particular have raised the cost of living considerably for many people across the globe, ourselves included. Many resources are overstretched, some staple crops are failing or falling short, and the wars are still raging. We can't speak for the people directly impacted by these wars, but we do feel compelled to amplify perspectives that question what is actually happening and why, and help to reconnect us with the humanity of those who are suffering. The suffering and trauma are immeasurably vast, and their justifications seem to have little basis in reality. We believe those justifications must be interrogated and called out for their deliberate and calculated deceptions. We Do Not Forget represents a journey of processing the past few years through that mysterious synergy between words and music. It is a coping mechanism, an interrogation, an investigation, an analysis, an emotional outburst, and an affirmation, among other things. These articles aim to help visualize that journey from a more personal perspective. Neurodivergence is another key theme in this journey. Many of my loved ones have various diagnoses, and those who don't possibly should. And as I write this, I am in the process of self-referring for an autism diagnosis that has required me to reflect on my entire life from the relatively newfound perspective of undiagnosed autism. Reframing my past through the lens of undiagnosed and largely unsupported autism has been its own challenge. While I've learned to recognize and acknowledge my considerable privilege as a white middle-class male, I've also struggled silently all of my life with challenges that I've only recently begun to understand. As I grow older and bear the responsibility of raising 2 children in a largely neurotypical world, it is becoming steadily more difficult to cope with these challenges. Making records still happens, it just happens slower than it used to. Please keep bearing with us. One beautiful consequence of the autism self-referral process is that it has made me reflect more deeply on my life's core learnings from my earliest memories, how and why I've learned them, and how that all relates to my work with Fold. Like many of my neurodivergent peers, I frequently fall down rabbit holes of research when an interesting thread presents itself, and indeed all members of Fold have similar tendencies in that regard. If anything one might call a gift emerges from that, it is the ability to connect seemingly disparate dots into coherent patterns and extrapolate bigger pictures. I feel compelled to know why things are happening and can't rest until reaching a satisfactory conclusion, which, sadly, is not always possible. Over the years, I've spent a large chunk of my brain power attempting to understand why things are the way they are in the world, with some success. The world of humans is a profoundly confusing place, and the reasons for that are both complex and fascinating. We lost most of my father's side of the family in the Holocaust. At the hands of the Nazi regime, my family were among millions of men, women, and children who were subjected to the most depraved acts of inhumanity imaginable, including humiliation, torture, experimentation, rape, brutalization, and extermination, as they called it. Growing up, I found it hard to imagine how these horrors could have occurred. I was taught that the German people had experienced a kind of crisis cult mass hysteria, that it was all okay now because the good guys had won and they'd prevent it from ever happening again. In time, I learned that the good guys had done terrible things too. For example, the firebombing of Dresden, 2 atomic bombs dropped on Japanese cities, the use of both Nazi and Japanese research from horrific human experiments conducted in the death camps, and Unit 731, whose practitioners were pardoned as long as it could all be kept secret. IBM running the information logistics of the death camps, the forcible displacement of Palestinians in order to create what the British called a little loyal Jewish Ulster in the heart of potentially hostile Arabism, and so on. It turned out there were no good guys, or at least that it is meaningless to think in such absolute terms. I came to realize that the true purpose of power, the kind that conducts wars, that runs corporations, countries, and empires, that effectively runs the world, is to accumulate and protect private wealth by any means necessary. There is apparently no act so depraved that it can't be rationalized, ignored, or pardoned as long as it serves power's true purpose. I have seen very little evidence, if any, across history and today's world to challenge this assertion. We live among ever-shifting webs of overlapping and often contradictory realities. There is the empirical, measurable reality of the universe in all its dynamic complexity, such as we are able to perceive with our senses and scientific tools. It's difficult enough for any individual to grasp even a tiny fraction of this reality. Then there are the realities provided by stories. Stories act as cognitive scaffolding, shaping how we interpret the world and the events around us. Stories are much older than the written word. Across human history, stories have proven to be arguably the most effective vehicle for widely conveying ideas, information, and values, for preserving history, for galvanizing communities, for consolidating cultural identities, and last but not least, for ruling over people. At its most basic level, a story can be defined as an account of imaginary or real people and events, while a narrative is the choice of which events to relate and in what order. In other words, narratives determine how a story is told. Stories are routinely used by ruling classes to influence people's perceptions and even, as Noam Chomsky put it, to manufacture their consent. Such stories often borrow from a society's foundational myths and sometimes even form their own myths over time. Take the story of the British Empire. Through hundreds of years of colonialism, the, quote, imperial experience led to a sense of national superiority and a belief in the right to rule over other peoples, end quote. This sense of superiority still lingers in the national consciousness and is today called exceptionalism. The story of British Empire can be told in many different ways, and this is where narratives become the operative component. If you create a narrative that leaves out the brutality of colonialism, i.e. the slave trade, raping, pillaging, genocide, etc., then you're left only with that sense of national superiority and the bountiful days of a glorious former empire that its descendants can feel proud of. Ruling classes tap into this story by crafting and applying a particular narrative that usually serves a hidden purpose. For instance, when attempting to advance a major government policy that benefits private interests but effectively means channeling public wealth into private hands, the policy must somehow be made palatable or even desirable to the public. Brexit is, on one level, an example of this. The Leave campaign's entire narrative was distilled into a simple slogan: take back control. The Remain side failed to match this turn of brilliance, and it cost them dearly. To quote Dr. Tim Houghton, take back control effectively combined not just a sense of a positive future, albeit never defined or elaborated, but also suggested a sense of rightful ownership. Moreover, it helped to mobilize the anti-establishment support of voters who felt let down by their politicians. The Brexit referendum, as referendums are so often, was only driven in part by the question on the ballot paper. Frustrated by the sense that the political class had failed them, many ordinary citizens took the opportunity to vent their fury. End quote. Another example is war. The primary beneficiary of large-scale armed conflicts today is arguably the defense industry, with the U.S. being the largest exporter of weapons globally. When Israel began bombing Gaza in late 2023, the stock prices of U.S. corporations RTX, formerly Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, and Lockheed Martin, among others, skyrocketed. The directors of these companies openly discussed how good for business the Israeli strikes were. There's no question of morality in such discussions. Morality is always secondary, at best, to profit. The defense industry is also a major contributor to U.S. election candidates. Joe Biden received $3.3 million from the defense industry for his presidential campaign. Trump received $2.9 million. The total defense industry lobbying spend for that year was $112 million. These facts help to illustrate the close relationship in the U.S. between defense contractors, the Department of Defense, and politicians, which is what constitutes the U.S. military-industrial complex. There are similar arrangements in the UK and other major weapons exporting nations. The very thing that President Eisenhower warned us about in his 1961 farewell address has come to pass. That if left unchecked, the military-industrial complex would eventually produce unnecessarily vast amounts of arms and skew policy to ensure their sales. Taxpayer dollars are sent to countries like Israel and the Ukraine in the form of military aid and are then funneled back into the U.S. defense industry, who sell arms to those same countries. This is known as a transfer of wealth. It is also the incentivizing of not only war itself, but wars that go on for as long as possible. The military-industrial complex is incentivized to facilitate forever wars that are happening right now in Gaza, the Ukraine, and elsewhere. There is, of course, a requirement here to gain consent from the public. Too much outrage leads to instability that can disrupt the system. It is quite a challenge to justify the ripping apart of toddlers and mass graves of civilians, especially when those realities are broadcasted daily on social media. What we have seen deployed in order to manufacture consent, to borrow Noam Chomsky's phrase again, for the conduct of Israel in particular is both an extraordinarily vast propaganda campaign and an often violent silencing of dissenting voices, particularly within Gaza, where more than 173 Palestinian journalists have been killed since October 2023, with international media still barred from entering at the time of this writing. The use of narratives in this case runs the gamut from elaborate lies to the subtle use of the passive voice in headlines. There is hard evidence revealing the alarming extent to which Israeli lobbying has infiltrated the UK government. Protesters across the world have had to be vilified and persecuted, especially those attempting to disrupt and call out arms manufacturers supplying Israel. Opposition to Israeli actions has been systematically labeled anti-Semitic, whether it is or not. Many academics and journalists are fearful that speaking out against Israel will risk their livelihoods and reputations. Indeed, many who have spoken out have found this to be true. The scale of the propaganda campaign and how it works would require an entire book to cover adequately. Now, this example is a little closer to home for me. In the summer of 2024, all across the UK, far-right extremists targeted immigrants, Muslims, and non-white people generally with coordinated violence, along with organizations that help facilitate immigration. Of course, people need to be held accountable for their own actions. However, this also includes those who have conceived and proliferated the narratives of hatred that have systematically vilified and demonized immigrants, Muslims, and non-white people generally over many decades. These narratives have thoroughly permeated large swathes of the public consciousness and have shaped a false reality for millions. Those behind such narratives are collectively known as the politico-media complex, a collusion between elements within the government, private interests, the corporate media, and associated regulatory bodies like the Independent Press Standards Organization, or IPSO. The extremity of language used to demonize and vilify the aforementioned groups has been escalating in recent years, exacerbated to some extent by the binary opposition encouraged on social media platforms in order to drive engagement. As far back as 2015, the UN's High Commissioner for Human Rights urged the UK's tabloid press to curb incitement to hatred in the wake of some particularly horrible language written by Katie Hopkins. She was referring to migrants as cockroaches in much the same way that the Nazis referred to Jews during the Holocaust and Hutus referred to Tutsis during the Rwandan genocide. Complaints ensued, but in the end nothing was done about it. The IPSO ruled that Katie Hopkins was within her rights to say these things because migrants are not defined as a specific group of people. The UK's politico-media complex clearly demonstrated then that it has no intention of restricting the use of these narratives. The real reason for this, I believe, is not because of some noble adherence to free speech, but because these narratives are deliberately constructed and deployed to influence public perception. That wave of hatred towards immigrants in 2015, enabled by the politico-media complex, laid the groundwork for the EU referendum, and it worked. This latest wave of violence is partly a consequence of the politico-media complex's shameless deployment of hateful narratives that has, despite the Black Lives Matter movement and many other grassroots efforts to the contrary, continued unabated for at least 4 or 5 decades. Anti-Muslim rhetoric, in particular, helps to maintain a level of public mistrust of Arabic nations that feeds into pro-Israeli narratives and helps justify military actions in the Middle East. Each person that commits an act of violence still bears responsibility themselves, but if the politico-media complex remains unchallenged in any significant way, then all we can expect is more of the same violence. That said, one highly positive development is the extent to which these acts of violence were resisted by local communities. In the final week of escalation, plans were leaked and resistance was organized, in many cases outnumbering those intent on violence to such an extent that they were forced to back down. To me, this was an unusually large and visible demonstration by people in the UK who do not subscribe to the vilification and demonization of immigrants, among others, and who are sick and tired of having their cultural and national identities hijacked by purveyors and subscribers of hateful narratives. We count ourselves among them, and the fact that they significantly outnumbered their counterparts in many places is encouraging. Some think that we're doomed to forever repeat history, that this is all just human nature and the way things are. Yet our historical perspectives and understanding are shaped by subjective interpretations of stories left behind by dominant societies. Historical accounts in written form, all of which contain a degree of bias, go back no further than 6,000 years. Everything we know about human activities and societies before then is subject to even greater interpretation of archaeological and paleontological evidence. History really is a conversation, not a declaration. Although the face of our world has transformed dramatically throughout the course of human history, the way we run things hasn't fundamentally changed much since the dawn of civilization, essentially since the advent of surplus and the cultivation of cattle. New technology comes along periodically that enables ruling classes to have greater, and occasionally lesser, control over people, and to acquire more resources more easily. Accumulating and protecting wealth at all costs is still the name of the game. What I've concluded from a lifetime of research, observation, and experience seems to be quite a radical notion. I believe that the primary, yet by no means only, reason for this lack of change in the way we run things is due to not enough of us learning how to recognize the manipulation of our own minds and the shaping of our own reality by stories and narratives. I believe that the vast majority of us are stuck in a cycle of subordination and hereditary trauma stretching back to our earliest civilized ancestors. I've also concluded that the key to changing this is for as many of us as possible to consciously break the cycle, just like our revolutionary forebears. None of the progress that granted us the freedoms we enjoy today were achieved without a demand against power, a concerted effort to break that cycle of oppression and trauma. It just hasn't happened on a large enough scale yet. The good news is that there are many ways to break the cycle that we can all engage with immediately. Here are a few that I believe we ought to prioritize. Number 1, teach people how stories and narratives shape our reality, how to recognize when they are wielded deliberately to influence our perception, how the politico-media complex works, and to always ask who benefits. 2, resist and rail against the normalization of dehumanization wherever possible. Never allow yourself to become desensitized to violence against human beings. 3, keep spaces open for people to speak freely in everyday life. Resist the silencing of dissenting voices and defend our right to protest. 4, build communities. Begin restructuring society around the fundamental unit of community rather than the patriarchal nuclear family. All evidence points towards this being better for our collective and individual health and well-being, along with logistics and resource sharing or sustainability. 5, break the cycle in our own lives. We all inherit dysfunctional behavior and toxicity from our parents or others and society at large. If we do the work to improve ourselves, we not only shift that toxicity and dysfunction, but also model growth and self-improvement for younger generations. 6, better integrate mental health skills and tools along with awareness of all forms of diversity, including neurodiversity, throughout our education system. 7, we are one family on one planet of interwoven life forms and ecosystems. As the early 20th century Scottish urban planner Patrick Geddes said, think global, act local. And that's the end of the last article. There is one bit in there that's missing from my own story, which took me a very long time to learn, is that as an autistic or neurodivergent person, I have many subtle needs. And in my life, the only times when I've really been able to thrive is when I've lived in a highly supportive community that understood me really well. I haven't had that for much of my life. And so the times when I have had it, I've been able to recognize why they were so special and why I was so happy. So I am forever trying to build that kind of community, one where I'm connected to a wide group of people in a very meaningful way, where there's strong mutual understanding of each other and mutual support. And it doesn't mean that you have people who are constantly attending to your every need. Nobody has to give very much, but it's just about having the right level of support and connection. And I'm sure this is true for everybody, but I guess the way that it manifests itself, the specific arrangements, the number of people, the nature of the people, all of those things play a role. And that is really central to my story. I've come to understand that it really does take a village to raise a human being. And in my case, it takes a village to lift me up and enable me to thrive. And in Western society, things really are much more atomized than they once were. It's convenient for capitalism to keep everyone atomized. Everybody has to have one of everything. It doesn't work for capitalism for people to share. So there are forces that are, for many reasons, attempting to divide us and keep us in our little cells. And we had the pandemic, and that really took its toll on me. I know that, for a part of that, I enjoyed the sort of peace and quiet. And although I crave connection and I need real life social interaction with people on a regular basis, at the same time, I also need quite a lot of my own space in which to recharge and reflect and just be myself, by myself, doing my thing. It's a tricky balance to get right. I think this is pretty common in my family too. I always remember something my father said, which is quite funny. He said that he loves people, he just can't stand most people. But being disconnected from people for that long was really bad for me. It had extremely negative impacts. I don't know if I may never recover from that. I'm not sure. And I think that's true for a lot of people and is underestimated. So yeah, that's fundamental to my story, understanding the role of community. Our song Choose Love was about this. It was speaking through the voice of Bell Hooks, who said a lot of these things and had a really keen understanding of the importance of love. We can do a whole episode about love and the role love plays in society and how love is treated and sort of trivialized and overly romanticized. And if we sit and think about its actual functions in society, love plays an enormously important role. Love is absolutely fundamental to the foundation of society. I don't think our success is based on survival of the fittest. It's survival of the most cooperative. The success of our species is all about how we've been able to work together over and above what we can achieve as individuals. And I'll end it on that as a positive note. Thank you very much for listening. I'm sorry that it was more of an audiobook, but hopefully some of that resonated. And I know it's a little bit outdated. It's a couple of years, and things have very much changed. The landscape has shifted even more since then, but we'll be talking about that more in upcoming episodes, of course. We hope you'll stay tuned for the next one. Peace.